Well, thank you very much, Barbara. Firstly, can I acknowledge the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, and my co-conspirator in the budget, the Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, the best possible Finance Minister anyone could ask for. Indeed, when every spending minister comes up to the ERC, it's very easy sitting next to Matthias Cormann because he looks at them in the eye and he just says, "No, no, I see you next year." And I said, we're going to make it sure that it happens next year. So, Matthias, thank you for the incredible work that you've done. To my ministerial colleagues who are here, to the secretaries of the Department of PM&C, Treasury and Finance, thank you to the professionalism of your staff and the hard work of everyone within the public service who has made this budget possible. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when I was preparing for this budget, I spent over a week locked down in Treasury. And as I usually do when I'm on the road, I FaceTimed my family with my wife and my daughter Gemma, who's 4, and my son, who's 2. And my wife has been teaching my daughter about what I do. I'm not a footballer, I'm not a tennis player, I'm actually a politician. And as we were on FaceTime, my wife turned to my daughter and says, "Gemma, do you know what a budget is?" And she turned around and says, "Yes, you're not supposed to lose other people's money." And so with that very sound advice, I have helped prepare this budget with a lot of other people. And this budget outlines our economic plan, and it's a plan that sets Australia up for the next decade. I firmly believe that this budget sets Australia up for a brighter future, one with lower taxes, more infrastructure, better skills and record spending on schools and hospitals. And as you may have picked up last night, all without increasing taxes. You would have seen the headlines this morning about some of the big numbers. Tax cuts for more than 10 million Australians and 3 million small businesses. 80,000 new apprenticeships. A $100 billion new infrastructure plan. And what you might not have noticed is some of the smaller but deeply significant measures. And I thought today I would outline some of these. Indeed, there are hundreds of measures in the budget. But it's some of these smaller measures that it will make a real difference to people's lives. Because a strong economy is not just a piece of paper or numbers on a page. It matters to people. It allows you to do things that you might not have otherwise done. It's not an end in itself, it's merely a means to an end. And so last night we announced that the government is boosting funding for mental health by $730 million, with a real focus on mental health in our young people and suicide prevention. This is the most significant investment of its kind, and to illustrate how it could change people's lives for the better, I want to share with you some thoughts of someone who's very close to me and works daily with me, who suffers from severe depression and has lived a life of quiet desperation. I never knew until last night of his personal struggles, when he approached me to share his story. He is a father and an active member of his local community, who was first diagnosed with severe depression 20 years ago. It started out as the telltale signs of loss of appetite and insomnia. He would average 3 hours of sleep a night and then try to hold down a full-time job. He felt, in his words, like a zombie. No feeling of happiness or sadness, just personal pain. Being a male in his 20s, he thought that he could beat it all himself. For 3 months, he tried to fight it, and he suffered in silence. Too ashamed to talk to someone about it or go and see a doctor, he finally admitted that he had a weakness, he had a mental illness. He thought about taking his own life and had planned on how to do it. But he worked up the courage eventually to see the doctor. He started medication, which he takes daily ever since, and he manages his illness effectively, and he lives a normal life. But he is just one of the fortunate ones in our community who did get help in time. Every year, over 65,000 Australians make a suicide attempt. Suicide is the leading cause of death for Australians aged between 15 and 44, and the second leading cause of death of those of the age of 45 to 54. 8 Australians today will tragically take their own lives, and 6 of those will be men. Around 3,000 people a year, and a 9% increase between the years 2017 and 18. Younger Australians are more likely to take their own life than to die in a motor vehicle accident. And the suicide rate for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is approximately twice that of non-Indigenous Australians. So to anybody who is listening today, who is in crisis or is feeling suicidal, please reach out for help. Call Lifeline, call 131114, and someone will be there to help. As a government, we have to do better, and as a nation, we have to do better. And I know this is something that the Prime Minister feels very strongly about and is personally very committed to, having led this particular initiative through the budget process. Funding that we announced last night will provide for 30 new Headspace services, a perinatal mental health program, 4 specialist residential facilities for eating disorders, and more support for Indigenous youth through mentoring and peer support. The high rate of suicide, particularly among our young people, is a national tragedy which we have to take urgent action to address. We will expand the Headspace network, reduce waiting times, and enable more people to get this support that they need. Like a young person from Echuca with depression and anxiety, like a young student in Western Sydney experiencing stress before exams who needs clinical support to remain engaged in their studies, or a young person bullied in Townsville who will not experience unreasonable wait times in order to receive support. These are policies and initiatives that will address a missing gap in our health system. These are policies and initiatives that will save people's lives. We are also committed in this budget to ensuring every Australian has access to affordable medicines. We continue to list more medicines on the PBS so that patients only pay $6.50 if they're on a concession, or $40.30 if they're a general patient. In addition to Besponsa, which I announced last night, other drugs to treat inoperable breast cancer without a subsidy, these people will pay $55,000 per year. We've also listed drugs to deal with a rare and highly aggressive type of skin cancer, lung cancer, which would otherwise cause patients $88,000 per course of treatment, as well as other drugs that deal with chronic lymphatic leukemia, which would otherwise cost $165,000 per course. We have listed over 2,000 new drugs as a government on the PBS at a cost of more than $10 billion, and this is one of our proudest achievements. We're also continuing to guarantee Medicare. Around 9 out of every 10 GP services are now bulk billed. In this budget, we're increasing the Medicare rebate for important diagnostic services, including ultrasound and X-ray imaging, to reduce the cost to patients. We're investing $150 million to expand the number of Medicare-eligible MRI machines to more than 50 new MRI-funded units within the last 12 months. This will give patients from around Australia better access to life-saving scans, including at Mount Druitt Hospital in New South Wales, Ipswich Hospital in Queensland, Kalgoorlie Health Campus in Western Australia. There are new Medicare services for MRI that will help diagnose 14,000 breast cancer patients each year. We're delivering a $1.1 billion package to support Australia's doctors and specialists to deliver improved access and outcomes for patients. $450 million extra to support GPs. And this will also allow Australians over the age of 70 to sign up for more personalised and coordinated care in partnership with their local GP. In this budget, there are a number of initiatives to support aged care. An additional $7 billion we are providing and supporting older Australians to receive aged care in their own homes and live independently for longer. We have increased the number of home care packages from 60,000 in 2013 to 124,000 in 2019. The government is providing almost $6 billion to extend the Commonwealth Home Support Program. Access to essential home support services like Meals on Wheels to help almost 1 million older Australians who are still living in their own homes. In residential aged care, the government has invested $320 million in this budget, and this will support the increase in residential places. These are the real stories of the budget. Programs that make a difference to people's lives, people who need our help. It is only through a strong economy and sound budget management that you can sustainably provide these services. This is why budget discipline and a strong economy are so important. We have been able to make record investments in health and education, in aged care and disability support. When it comes to education, we are spending and increasing by 63%, with record funding for government, independent and Catholic schools. Disability funding is increasing by 10% a year, and hospital spending has increased by more than 60%, with more beds, more doctors and more nurses. Medicare funding is at record levels, with more Australians today visiting the doctor without having to pay. We have bolstered Medicare with an additional $1.1 billion in primary care support for our doctors and our patients. These are the investments that we can afford to make. Last night, I outlined our plan for Australia's economy. A plan to restore the nation's finances, a plan for lower taxes, a plan for more infrastructure across the country, a plan for better skills for Australian workers, and a plan to grow the economy to underwrite the essential services that we need. To deliver on the things that matter, it's fundamentally important to have the books in order. For the first time in more than a decade, we are delivering a budget surplus. In 2019-2020, the surplus is $7.1 billion. Over the forward estimates, surpluses will be $45 billion. And surpluses will continue to rise over the decade to be more than 1% of GDP, eliminating Commonwealth net debt by 2030. And all of this is being achieved without increasing taxes. We have reduced the rate of spending growth by more than half. It's the lowest of any government in 50 years. the proportion of working-age Australians on welfare is the lowest in 30 years, and this has contributed to government payments falling to 24.6% of GDP in 2019-20. This is below both the 30-year average and the 25.4% that we inherited when we came to government. While commodity prices have been strong, our forecasts have been conservative. In the budget, we expect the iron ore price to decline from $80 today to about $55 by June next year, and metallurgical coal to decline from about $200 today to about $150 over the same period. These forecasts are consistent with the Coalition's prudent approach and Treasury's comprehensive industry-wide consultation. It also reinforces the point that future surpluses are based on broad-based growth, and that is across the economy. They are not based on inflated commodity assumptions. Surpluses do not occur by accident, and turning around the budget has taken 6 years through disciplined decisions. And those decisions have affected both sides of the ledger. Our strong budget management has been recognised, with Australia maintaining its AAA credit rating, one of only 10 countries in the world to do so. And Standard & Poor's said last night, in response to the budget, that the central government will achieve stronger fiscal outcomes than we anticipated, going on to say better labour market conditions have lowered expenditure outflows compared with previous budgets. These stronger outcomes have helped to fund new policy announcements in today's budget. Ladies and gentlemen, if we were to lose our AAA credit rating, all Australians would suffer. It would mean higher interest rates, higher mortgages and higher costs to business loans. This is why sticking to our economic plan is so important. Our plan is the insurance for Australia to get a more secure and better future. A government that gets the good books back in order sends a strong signal that we can, as a nation, be more confident in our ability to deal with the challenges that lie ahead. The policies we announced last night in relation to tax will ensure that over 10 million Australians receive a tax cut of up to $1,080 or a couple up to $2,160 in just 13 weeks' time when they put in their next they put in their tax return. This is money that could go towards the monthly mortgage payment, the quarterly energy bill or the yearly car insurance. These are structural reforms that are aimed at incentivising effort and innovation to boost our nation's productivity. When we combine the changes to the low and middle income tax offset with our policy to reduce the 32.5 cents in the tax bracket to 30 cents in the dollar, that is a change that will ensure more than 94% of taxpayers pay no more than 30 cents in the dollar. It will boost our nation's productivity and will help ease the cost of living pressures. In the budget last night, there were also significant measures for small business. The nation's 3.4 million small and medium-sized businesses will also get access now to an instant asset write-off that has been increased to $30,000 and expanded to businesses with a turnover of up to $50 million. This will help a tradie buy a new ute or a cafe owner replace their coffee machine. And these are stories from all across the country, from the more than 350,000 small businesses who have already taken advantage of the instant asset write-off. Lower, not higher taxes will bring about a stronger economy and prepare it for the challenges ahead. For those who advocate higher taxes on income and business, I simply ask the question, how can removing incentives to work more, save more and invest more be good for the economy? It's not fairness that higher taxes just for sake, it's also economic growth. New taxes, higher taxes, suffocate enterprise and aspiration, which will weaken the economy. You cannot tax your way to bigger surpluses. You cannot tax your way to prosperity. Our plan, announced last night, also includes a significant boost in infrastructure development, a boost to the budget that underwrites a 10-year infrastructure plan, a plan to bust congestion, unlock the potential of our regions and get products faster to market. The coalition government understands that infrastructure is critical to Australia's economic prosperity. For every infrastructure dollar invested, there is a $4 payoff to the economy. And in this budget, we have major investments in every state and territory. A fast rail plan to connect our major cities with our regions. $2 billion in this budget as a down payment on the Geelong to Melbourne route. It's not a fanciful vision to better connect Sydney and Melbourne, which would double down on the population pressures in our two biggest cities. It's a plan to grow our regions and take the strain off our most congested areas. And we're also increasing the Urban Congestion Fund to remove bottlenecks and increase access to public transport. There are plenty of stories where the congestion is hurting people in their daily lives. And this budget, with this increase to the Congestion Fund, will help make a difference. And the budget also has a major skills package, $525 million to create 80,000 new apprenticeships, 10 new training hubs that will connect our schools and local industries in areas of high youth unemployment, and a new literacy, numeracy and digital skills program. And this builds on other initiatives that we have underway, including our support for 55,000 women under our Future Female Entrepreneurs program. The PATH program, which provides internships for young people as a stepping stone into employment, has been a great success, with 70% of people getting a permanent job. This new skills package, existing policies like the PATH program, are making a difference in creating the highest number of young people who are getting a job in many, many years. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to the economic outlook, we need to boost the productive capacity of the economy. We know that the path to more jobs, higher wages and a better life is a strong economy. Over the last 2 years, businesses have been hiring more people than ever, and the investment outlook is the strongest since the mining boom. Mining investment is expected to make its first positive contribution to growth after falling by around 60% since 2012-13. And outside of the mining sector, we also have a strong outlook. Non-mining investment grew by 9.7% in 2017-18, its fastest pace in over a decade and well above the 10-year average of 1.5%. This is important as investment supports the uptake of technology across the economy and makes labour more productive so workers can command a higher wage. Exports also remain solid as output in our resources sector continues to ramp up. Particularly LNG, which at over $50 billion in export revenue this year, has become our second largest resources export, overtaking metallurgical coal in 2018-19 and second only to iron ore. Our strong and competitive education and tourism sectors also continue to benefit from their proximity to a strong and growing Asian region. In 2018, there were nearly 1.5 million tourists, which was twice as many as 5 years ago from China. Our existing pipeline of public infrastructure investment is strong and will also support activity and job creation. With unemployment now falling to 4.9%, it's the lowest level in more than 7 years, and Treasury has upgraded its outlook to reflect that fact. We know that there are challenges ahead, and we also know that we all have choices as to how we respond to those challenges. We have an economic plan that is working, a plan that has delivered a $55 billion turnaround and a return to surplus, the first in more than a decade. a plan that has reduced the proportion of working Australians on welfare to their lowest level in 30 years, a plan that has delivered 1 million new jobs ahead of schedule, and now we recommit to creating more than 1.25 million new jobs over the next 5 years. Being in government is about plans, their execution and their delivery. The fundamentals of the Australian economy are sound. Australia is in its 28th year of consecutive economic growth, with the economy reaching $2 trillion next year. This budget is the product of responsible economic management and decisions taken over 6 years, a plan that is firmly based on lower taxes. In light of these challenges, it's more important than ever that we continue to grow the economy by sticking to our plan. The dividend for the Australian people is spending more on the things that matter to them: local schools, hospitals and roads, and mental health services like the ones I talked earlier about. And importantly, we need to allow people to keep more of their own hard-earned money. We believe that people should earn more and that they should keep more of what they earned. It's not worth the risk of another path of higher taxes when we are reaping the rewards of years of disciplined fiscal management. Difficult but necessary choices. This is the course that we, as a coalition government, that the Morrison government has set for a better and brighter Australia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Treasurer. Before we take questions from the floor, the decision to extend the one-off energy payment to Newstart, which I'd like to focus on, and other recipients, given that it wasn't in the budget papers, could you give us some detail on when that decision was arrived at and how that came about?
Well, obviously the reason why Newstart was not included in those original suite of payments that people receive and that we're going to get the energy assistance was because with Newstart, 3/4 of people move off it within 12 months. 99% of people who are on Newstart get another payment. They get a parenting payment or they get a family tax benefit payment. Whereas when you're on the disability support pension or you're on the age pension, you tend to be on it for a lot longer, and that is your principal form of payment. So we excluded Newstart originally from it. Last night, the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister and myself discussed the issue, and we thought it was appropriate to extend it. It's going to cost the budget an extra $80 million because this payment will be out before the end of the financial year. That hits the numbers for the 18-19 year, doesn't affect the surplus numbers for 19-20. I think it's obviously a prudent decision. It's one that will provide $75 for singles and $125 for couples from this additional energy supplement to acknowledge that they do face cost of living pressures and ease some of the energy costs.
David Crowe.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks, Treasurer, for your speech. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. You've talked a lot about the projected surplus. The Coalition came to government in 2013 talking about a budget emergency. It's had 5 years plus to act on that problem, and now we get to this financial year and there's a $4 billion deficit. At the same time, we can see in the budget papers that there's $2.8 billion in spending in this financial year. You're tantalisingly close to that balanced budget this financial year, but you couldn't get there. Could you not have been a bit stricter on spending over that time frame? Why could you not get to a budget surplus this year?
Well, David, we've actually been very disciplined in spending across the board. If you look at the start of our term from the 13-14 year to the end of the forwards, we have brought the rate of spending growth to 1.9%. That is below less than half of what we inherited, and certainly the lowest of any government in 50 years. When you look at what we've done is a percentage of GDP spending as well that is below the 30-year average and significantly below what we inherited. But when it came to the 18-19 year, we faced a number of one-off costs. So we had extra GST payments to the states. We had the impacts of flood and drought. We had some one-off expenses in relation to defence equipment, and all that put pressure on the budget. So yes, we improved the 18-19 year from what was expected at MyEFO, but we couldn't bring it to surplus. We would have brought it to surplus if we could, but of course the 19-20 surplus year is $7.1 billion, which is a very significant surplus and one which would withstand any challenges in the next year.
Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Treasurer, the Labor Party has foreshadowed that it will do more for low-income people earning under $40,000, that it will do this through the tax system. I wonder what you say to critics who argue that you haven't done enough for these people, that really they're the losers in the budget.
I'd say far from it. In fact, the nature of our reforms, and there are two series of reforms here. There's the immediate relief with the adjustments to the low middle income tax offset, which will put that money in people's pockets, $1,080 in 13 weeks' time. But then there's also the structural reform of bringing the 32.5% down to 30% for that particular tax bracket. That's going to create a fairer, simpler tax system. And the people at the lower end of the income scale will actually get a higher proportion of their tax bill reduced as a result of the policies that we have put in place. The Labor Party, when it comes to Limito, have actually got it at $530 in 2018-19. We've now got it at $1,080, so it's quite significant. And the Labor Party did not support our structural changes that we passed through the Parliament for stages 2 and 3, which will see the abolition of the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket altogether. So Labor talks a big game when it comes to taxes, but they deliver very little because, in fact, they're taking with one hand or giving with one hand and taking with the other, because they have not committed to all three stages of our tax plan.
David Uren.
David Uren from the Australian newspaper. Treasurer, over the last 2 years, changes in the economy which Treasury did not anticipate, or parameter changes, have boosted the budget bottom line by more than $10 billion a year. In the final year of your budget, when the second stage of the tax cuts in, the surplus almost halves to just $9 billion. How can you be confident that you are not recycling temporary gains in revenue into permanent income tax cuts?
Well, the reason why the surplus goes down to $9.2 billion in that particular year is because there's two changes happening at the same time with the tax. You've phased out the Limito, and people are still claiming it in the next tax year, but you're also increasing the 19% tax bracket from $37,000 to $45,000. That's both happening in that particular year. So that explains why the surplus goes down to $9.2 billion. But I think in terms of how we are dealing with parameter variations, I mean, for example, public hospitals. An extra $1.9 billion needed to be found because that wasn't estimated with this particular demand-driven scheme. So while there were changes, for example, around the National Disability Insurance Scheme, because the take-up wasn't as high as first expected, and obviously it will as the scheme transitions to full implementation. But on the public hospital side, we had to find an extra $1.9 billion. So this smooths it out. The other parameter variations that are sometimes hard to predict relate to the interest costs that the government has on debts, and because the interest rates have come down, that has flowed through as well to some improvements to the bottom line in that respect.
Phil Curry.
Hi, Treasurer. Phil Curry from the Financial Review. A bit of a follow to David's question, but when the Coalition came to power in 2013, Tony Abbott, then Prime Minister, and Joe Hockey set a target of getting surpluses to 1% of GDP within 10 years. As a buttress against future shocks and those sorts of things. In the MyFO, you're on track for 24-25. Yesterday, you've pushed it back another year, presumably because you're spending so much on tax cuts at that stage, on stage 3 and others. What was the rationale for putting tax relief ahead of a strong surplus? Was it an economic one or a political imperative?
Well, this budget has been driven by the economics of providing for a stronger economy and a better future for all Australians, and we hit more than 1% of GDP with our surpluses in 26-27, and it obviously increases substantially so that we can pay off net debt by 2030. But in terms of the decisions, well, we're guided by our fiscal strategy, and our fiscal strategy makes very clear that we need to put our surpluses to paying off debt, but we also need to have a sustainable tax burden. And we have an internal discipline with a tax to GDP cap at 23.9%. Now, in this budget, it's 23.3%. And when Chris Bowen stood up at the National Press Club after the election in 2013, he set 4 tests for the government. He said you've got to have a AAA credit rating, you've got to have unemployment below 6.25%. He says you've got to keep your tax to GDP below 23.7%, and we've done all of those things. The Labor Party has now abandoned any pretence of a tax to GDP cap. We have not, and we would have hit that cap in 22-23 but for providing for these tax cuts in this budget. So philosophically, Phil, Liberals and Nationals believe in lower taxes and returning the money to people's pockets when we get an opportunity to do so. We've combined both immediate relief in this budget with a structural reform with a 32.5% down to 30%. I think they're both significant reforms, and to think that Australia, by the time this plan is fully rolled out in 24-25, will have 70% of taxpayers who are earning between $45,000 and $200,000 paying no more than 30 cents in the dollar. That is a very significant development which will ensure that people, regardless of the jobs that they change throughout their lives, may not encounter bracket creep, and that will not be a disincentive for them to work a bit harder.
Laura Jays.
Laura Jays from Sky News. Treasurer, thank you. Big business is still wondering what's in this budget for them. They're dealing with countries with comparable tax rates, New Zealand 28%, Hong Kong 16.5%, the US 21%, you know the list. Even Labor is promising an investment guarantee. Is this a signal that you've given up on delivering those big business tax cuts?
Well, what we've delivered for big business is a stronger economy out of last night's budget, and ultimately they're the beneficiaries. So what we have done by lowering tax rates for more than 13 million Australians, what we have done with a $100 billion infrastructure spend over the decade, what we have done with a skills package is actually strengthen the workforce, strengthen routes to markets and supply chains, and of course put more money in people's pockets so that they can spend more in those businesses. That's what big business will get out of this budget. I'd also point out that one of the things that we're most proud of as a government is also the free trade agreements that we've struck. When we came to government, just over 20% of our trading partnerships were subject to free trade agreements. Now it's well over 70%, and when all these free trade agreements are implemented, it will be 88%. And the most recent being Indonesia, but that comes off the back of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China, Korea and Japan. The Labor Party doesn't have the same faith in free trade agreements as we do. And free trade agreements open up job opportunities. 1 in 5 Australians are employed in free trade. The other thing I'd say to big business is don't sign up to Bill Shorten's industrial relations plan, because it will actually mean chaos on your shop floor. I mean, bringing back pattern bargaining, some of the other changes to enable the unions to basically have a seat at the cabinet table. Even this discussion about forcing changes to the minimum wage, it is bad news for the economy, it's bad news for business. So there is a very clear difference between the Labor Party and the Coalition when it comes to what is good for economic activity, for jobs and ultimately for the business community. We're in favour of more trade. We're in favour of a sensible industrial relations system which has seen a 40% drop in industrial disputation since we've come to government, and we're in favour of lower taxes. It's a very big contrast. And when it comes to lower taxes, one of them that will really hurt when Labor's increasing taxes is going to really hurt the business community is the changes around franking credits, because that goes to capital formation in the economy. If companies can't offer the same level of dividend imputations that they now do to the same number of people, then people in their self-managed super funds have no incentive to invest in Australian companies. They'll go and invest offshore in indexed funds in the United States. This will make it more difficult for Australian companies to raise capital. And the hardheads in the business community and independent economists have all pointed this out. This is a dramatic transformation in the way capital will be formed in this country. It will hurt publicly listed companies, and ultimately, if you hurt publicly listed companies, you hurt job growth in the community as well.
James Campbell.
Sorry, thank you, Treasurer. James Campbell, Herald Sun. Correct me if I'm wrong, Treasurer, but my understanding is that the budget only includes 1 year's funding for 4-year-old kinder. Is it the government's intention that that funding will end after 1 year? And if not, why isn't it the funding included in the forward estimates?
So every single year that we've been in government, we've funded it this way: $2.8 billion for universal access to preschool for 4-year-olds. Now, this has been primarily the responsibility of states, but states do it very differently. Some do it, like Western Australia, through the school system. Others do it through long day care, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland. We want to work with the states through the Education Council, Dan Tehan, to effectively get a holistic approach to the country. That will be important. So we are absolutely committed to this program, but we want to work with the states. We've asked for a review. The other thing, James, that we're very concerned about is non-attendance. Currently, you've got about 30% of non-attendance for preschool learning. It's particularly acute in regional communities and Indigenous communities. It can be 40 to 45%. These are the kids that are actually needed most. So we need to work with the states, who have primary responsibility for this program, to get better standards in relation to preschool. That's something that we've put on the table. We've asked for the review. We want to sit down with the states. We're committed to funding it going forward. This is for the 2020 year, for the 2020 school year that we're funded. So someone going in now who's there in 2019 will also be funded next year.
But James is right, is he, that it's only funded for 1 year?
It's funded to the end of the 2020 year.
Okay. Andrew Probyn.
Treasurer Andrew Probyn from the ABC. Thanks for your speech. Political parties of both stripes have been proud over the years of the progressive nature of the tax scales. Indeed, some are proud of it. Under your plan, by the 1st of July 2024, people between earning between $45,000 and $200,000 will be paying 30% tax rate. What's progressive, indeed what's fair, about someone on $45,000 paying the same rate of tax as someone on $200,000?
Well, the fact is that someone on $200,000 under our plan pays 10 times as much tax as someone who's on $45,000. So the key point here is that we are incentivising people to stay in work, to work longer, to work more. Now, the progressive nature of our system sees the top 5% of taxpayers currently paying about a third of all tax. When our plan is fully rolled out by 24-25, that proportion that 5% pays actually increases. So the system arguably even gets more progressive under our plan. It also applies to the top 1% of taxpayers paying more under our plan as a proportion of the overall tax burden. But what we need is a simplified tax system, Andrew, and I think that's what we've got. But certainly the low and the middle income taxpayers will benefit out of this budget. And the fact that if you're in that 48 to 90,000 tax bracket, you will get the full Limito, the full $1,080 in your pocket when you put in your next tax return. So if you're a couple, a teacher and a tradie on $60,000 each, you'll get $2,160 in your pocket in 13 weeks' time, whereas if you're on $200,000, you're not getting much at all.
Malcolm Farr.
Malcolm Farr from news.com.au. Treasurer, thanks for your address. The budget papers indicate a pretty rapid and substantial population growth, going from something like 25 million in 2018 to close to 27 million in 2022. That's even with, I assume, the immigration cap that the coalition government has proposed. Is that swift and substantial population growth a factor in unemployment continuing to hover around 5%, as the budget papers also indicate? And is it also a factor in wage growth being rather sluggish for the next 4 or 5 years or so?
Well, wage growth will actually pick up to 3.5%, and it's currently, the wages price index is 2.3%, which is faster than inflation. But wages will pick up, and that's the advice of the Reserve Bank Governor. And the reason why wages pick up is because you're getting a tighter labour market, because you're actually getting more competition for labour, and we're starting to see that in certain industries. With respect to the migration settings, as you know, the Prime Minister's announced that the cap is coming down from 190 to 160 for permanent migration. The issue is, I mean, migration does help employment levels. It does stimulate economic activity. But at the same time, we as a country need to better manage population growth, because you're seeing Melbourne growing by 2,000 or more people a week. And this is putting real pressure on services, health services, education services, public transport. You know, the roads are much more clogged than they ever were. So what we are focusing on, working with the states, is to better share data, to better strategise together, to effectively get the infrastructure in place that will alleviate that congestion in the cities and unlock the potential of the regions. So if you're in Melbourne and you can travel to Geelong in 30 minutes, that will completely change the way you go about things. Now, when the intergenerational report was done in the early 2000s, it predicted that Australia would get to a 25 million population by 2040. Well, we got to 25 million last year. So we have grown much faster than was originally forecast, and I think it's fair to say that governments of all persuasions, state and federal, have failed to properly plan for that population change. That is now changing. We've got an integrated plan. We're working closely with the states. We're all in this together, and that's why we're funding a lot of this infrastructure.
Peter Van Onselen.
Peter Van Onselen for Network 10. I wanted to go back to the Newstart backflip, if I can, and ask a follow-up. When you were answering that first question from Sabra, you gave what were some very cogent, well-argued, well-articulated reasons why, through a long budget process, you decided on the position that you took as a government, as an ERC, as a treasurer. Then you told us that you had a meeting last night with the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister, and you changed your mind. Why?
Well, I think it's very important that we alleviate some of these cost of living pressures, and we were focused on putting this additional $80 million to work and applying it to Newstart. This will also secure the passage of the piece of legislation through the Parliament, and that is important as well, because we want it to be in people's pockets before the end of this financial year. That's our commitment, and now there's no excuse not to pass it.
Mark Riley.
Mark Riley, Treasurer from the Seven Network. Also a question on this new budget addendum. When you're making this decision and laying out, as Peter said, your cogent reasons not to do it in the first place, you said that people on Newstart, or 3/4 of them, are on it for less than a year and transit often on the payment, and I think you said 90%.
99%.
99% have other payments, very persuasive arguments. So my question is on the detail of how this applies then. If someone is qualified or classified on a Newstart for a day, a week, a month and a year, do they get the payment? If there are 2 or 3 siblings in a family who are all on Newstart for various periods of a year? Do they get 3 supplements, or does a household get 1? How does it work?
If you're on Newstart, you get the payment. It's very simple as that. And the same applies whether you're on the disability support pension, whether you're on the carers payment, whether you're on the age pension, whether you're on certain veterans payments. They're the various payments that are now subject to this additional $75 per individual.
Catherine Murphy.
Hello, Treasurer. Catherine Murphy from Guardian Australia. A broader question, if I may. If you look at the history of this government from the first budget in 2014, the Joe Hockey, Tony Abbott famous austerity budget, to the one you handed down last night, it's like they could have been delivered by different governments. Would you agree that one of the problems of the Liberal and National parties over this term, apart from the leadership revolving door, has been this shape-shifting in terms of what you stand for, in terms of your policies and your economic program? So in the event that you are still Treasurer after the next federal election, do you first of all agree that it's important to actually do the work as, you know, a major centre-right political party in Australia, to be able to tell voters coherently what you stand for in economic terms? And if we call this an identity project, call it that, do you undertake to lead it as Treasurer, actually do the work?
Well, Catherine, I think it's always been core business for the Liberal Party to lower people's taxes, to invest more in infrastructure, to put the skills in place for the workforce of the future. That is core business. And what is particularly core business for us is for the country to live within its means, because that is a definition of fairness. If you keep running up budget deficits, you are basically handing the next generation an interest bill that will eat into the spending of otherwise important programs. You can't fund those essential services of health and education, putting drugs on the PBS, the mental health package, the support, the respite care for carers. All of that can be done because you have a strong economy. So I wouldn't accept the premise of your question. I would say that this is a budget that grows the economy while being responsible fiscal managers. I think there's a lot in this budget for us to be proud of. The fact that we're investing significantly in our regions, the fact that we are investing in small business as the engine room of the economy. You won't hear that language from those opposite, because we are very much focused on small business and our regions and growing the economy. So the reason why we've been able to spend into those targeted areas is because we have been responsible managers over recent years. The fact that spending as a proportion of GDP is now down to 24.6%, and it was 25.4% when we came to government, and it's below the 30-year average. The fact that we've stayed well below our tax cap to GDP at 23.3%. The fact that we are eliminating net debt by 2030. The fact that we've got $45 billion of surpluses. The fact that we have turned it around by $55 billion from the last budget we inherited. That's our record. That's our record. And, you know, some people might seek to write that that's all by accident, that some sort of commodity boom has delivered you this bonanza on budget night. It doesn't work that way. It actually works by having difficult decisions, negotiating with the crossbenchers in the Senate, going over the heads of the Labor Party who have tried to stop us every step of the way, and the product is now a stronger budget for the people of Australia. And they will be faced with a choice at the next election. The choice will be very clear. You can sign up to Bill Shorten and $200 billion of higher taxes and putting the unions in charge of the shop front and the back office, or you can vote for us. And we have delivered more than 1 million new jobs, trade agreements with the booming countries in our region, lower taxes for more than 13 million Australians, a simpler, flatter, more progressive tax system. That's our record. And at the same time, record funding for hospitals and schools and fully funding the NDIS and other important programs. The Labor Party will talk a big game, but they won't deliver it. We will.
Jade
Gailberger from The Advertiser. More than $2 billion of infrastructure spend was announced for South Australia in the budget, with much of that outside of the forward estimates and an election next month. what guarantee can you give to voters that these projects will actually go ahead?
Well, obviously there's important infrastructure projects that, are shovel-ready right now in South Australia, including under our congestion fund, with that money being spent. Now, the North-South corridor is a big commitment from us, and there are others. Now, obviously, you've got to work to timetables. You've got to work with state governments. You've got to put all the machinery in place to roll out that level of infrastructure. So it's a 10-year plan, with money out the door now and money out the door in the forwards and beyond. South Australia is no different, but South Australia is benefiting greatly from this $100 billion infrastructure package.
Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Sabra. Tim Shaw, Treasurer from Radio 2CC in Canberra. A lot of suit shops around Australia are ordering black suits today because we're back in the black, according to you and your government. What's your message to small business today? 1, pay your existing staff more. Wages growth has been flat. 2, take an instant asset write-off. Or 3, hire an Australian. You've got a plan for 1.2 million new jobs over the next 5 years, and you've proven over the last 5 that 1 million jobs can be grown. But what's plan B on jobs? But importantly, your message to those small business owners today?
Well, our message is we're behind you, and we're the only party that's behind you. And look at what we have done. We've cut taxes for small business to 25%. Put in place a $2 billion securitisation fund so you can increase access to finance. We are making changes to the employee share ownership scheme so people can get a buy-in at the start of that entrepreneurial approach in small business and get a stake in the outcome. We want small businesses to be paid on time by both government and big business, and we're leading the way. And this instant asset write-off, we're increasing it to $30,000 and applying it to companies with turnovers up to $50 million. That, as a result of last night, we've applied it to an additional 22,000 businesses employing 1.7 million Australians. So if those businesses were buying a grill for $12,000 for their food business, they could have only deducted $800 a year. Now they can deduct that $12,000 straight away. It's changes like that that make a real difference to the life of a small business. We stand with them, we listen to them, we've heard them, and we're acting for them.
Quentin Dempster.
Dempster, the New Daily Treasurer. There's been a number of questions on this from my colleagues today already, and it would be quite historic in 2024 if your structural changes to tax collections are achieved. No more than 30 cents in the dollar paid by what you said were in your speech 94% of taxpayers. You've addressed Andrew's question about denying that this signals the end of the progressive tax system. My question, as Australians have understood it, where the more you pay, proportionately you pay more. The more you earn, proportionately you pay more. But would Sir Robert Menzies accept and approve of the wholesale flattening of Australia's tax collection scales?
Well, he certainly believed in lower taxes because he used to say that it's not the government's money, it's the people's money. And we should always remember that. And we need to return as much of that money to them as possible. So you've got the double benefit of the tax cuts. You've got the benefit in that you are returning to people their money so that they can make their choice, but also more money in their hands means more economic activity across the economy. And that economic activity spurs the creation of new jobs. It's money that is spent in the local business, it's money that's spent in the big business, and ultimately that's good for the health of the Australian economy.
Thank you, Treasurer, for answering those questions. Everybody please join me in thanking the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg.